abroad in Turkey, in the Middle East, elsewhere. Um, we feel very lucky to have the author of Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, Stephen Wertheim, with us. Um, it's a very interesting, fascinating book on the origins of the U.S. global supremacy. It's I'm hoping it's going to be a fascinating discussion. Stephen is currently the Deputy Director of Research and Policy at the Quincy Institute. He's also a research scholar with Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University, my alma mater as well. My name is Kadir Üstün. I'm with the CETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. We focus on U.S.-Turkey relations, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and more generally, U.S. foreign policy. We've been doing some of these book discussions on U.S. foreign policy, and there has been an ongoing debate about what the U.S. role should be in the world in the wake of uh, Afghanistan war, Iraq war, what we call now endless wars, and many politicians have been promising to pull the U.S. out of those wars, but it's been quite difficult. And Stephen asks a very interesting question in this book, and let me just show the book as well. Um, that what is the or what how did we come to this idea that the US should be the preeminent power, the leading power in the world? It should dominate the global affairs, it should lead the world. Classic stories, of course, after the Second World War, with the Second World War, US became the undeniable leader of the world, and it was kind of unavoidable as the growing power of the United States prior to the Second World War made it almost, impossible not to. Um, but the book is interesting in that it focuses on about a 18-month period in 1940 and 1941, and it makes an argument. I'm gonna, of course, let the author talk about the argument, but what struck me was that Stephen was saying U.S. leadership was at that point a conscious choice by uh, experts and policymakers at the time who were devising plans about how to manage the post-war world, how to imagine U.S. role in that world. It wasn't happenstance. It was a careful construction in many ways, driven by economic interests, driven by geopolitical considerations, but also ideology. So it's a very interesting argument, and I think it contributes a lot to the debates around U.S. leadership, U.S. global leadership. And I want to turn to Stephen now to give us main contours of his main argument in this book. Thank you, Stephen, again for joining us, and thank you to those who are joining us on Zoom. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat Q&A box, not the chat. And then if those of you on social media post questions, our assistants will collect them and pose them to Stephen. So go ahead, Stephen, floor is yours.
Good morning and good afternoon. I think you've summarized the contours of the book pretty well. I guess the book for me arose out of a curiosity that derived from the world I saw around me. And specifically this throughout my adult lifetime, so about 3 decades. Now, well, little less. I'm dating myself. But let's take that 3-decade period since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I noticed that there was this bipartisan consensus that the United States, of course, had to be the supreme military power on earth and ring the world with US bases and make many security commitments abroad, and hold itself responsible for enforcing world order. And it seemed pretty clear to me, especially in the wake of 9/11 and the war on terror, the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, et cetera, that there were at least some serious costs to playing this kind of role. So I wanted to know, historically, where did this commitment come from, since it seemed that there was so little contestation over the commitment in our own time. And I realized that actually that kind of naturalization of America's global leadership, global military leadership, actually infused the scholarship as well, which is to say that historians and social scientists had, of course, paid a lot of attention to the rise of the United States to world power, but they had treated this as a kind of inexorable process, often, or in terms of some kind of struggle between internationalism and isolationism. And I didn't think that that was correct, because it seemed to me that one could find very few American policymakers who thought, as they do today, that the United States should play a globe-spanning military role before 1940, which is to say for most of what is still most of American history. And then there was a moment of decision. And that moment of decision crystallized as I went into archives and uncovered a network of people who were doing quite serious post-war thinking and planning, some in private and some in public, in a public debate, in a very tumultuous period in 18 months between the fall of France to Nazi Germany in the middle of 1940 and the attack on Pearl Harbor that officially brought the United States into World War II. And so I wanted to write the book understanding what were the reasons that prompted this decision for dominance, which, to be clear, was not just a decision about what the United States should do vis-a-vis World War II, get in, stay out, aid the Allies, but was actually squarely confronting the question of what America's post-war role should be. What was the general nature of international society, and how did the United States need to define its responsibilities afterward? And so that's what the book seeks to document, that moment of decision, which I think continues to clearly what the consensus around military dominance developed then, continues to drive American foreign policy today, even though conditions in the world are quite different from what they were in the middle of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. So, Stephen, in the book, first chapter is actually devoted to the time period from the foundation of the United States up until 1940, and you call that internationalism before isolationism. So you overall you oppose the idea that isolationists that was developed later, that term, and you oppose that term itself. That didn't People who thought that the U.S. should stay within the continent, within the Western Hemisphere, did not actually oppose internationalism. Can you kind of that was interesting for me. Can you explain what existed prior to 1940 before we move into detailed discussion about what happened in 40 and afterwards?
Prior to 1940, there were a number of Americans who identified themselves as internationalists, but they did so without reference to something that later came to be called isolationism. So if you were an internationalist, a self-described internationalist around the turn of the 20th century, and you were a prominent American or not prominent American, you would say that internationalism meant making an attempt to have intercourse, commerce with all, stay out of power politics centered in Europe, and also perhaps make efforts to transcend that system of power politics. That, for example, is what Woodrow Wilson claimed, at least, that his League of Nations was intended to do. He said it was not going to be an entangling alliance, but rather a disentangling alliance. Mm-hmm. And he was a nationalist and an internationalist. And so the discursive construction at that time was not isolationism versus internationalism, but rather with each side being mutually exclusive, but rather the framing given by most people was, how does one find the right balance between nationalism and internationalism? Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of conceptual world, the terrain in which American foreign policy debate took place. And it was a very wide-ranging debate. One could be, I would consider them to be an imperialist and to be an internationalist, but they were also within the realm of internationalism, criticisms of imperialism as well, including criticisms of what then prominent intellectuals like Raymond Leslie Buell in the 1920s called American imperialism, intervention in even Latin America, to say nothing of affairs in Europe. So what there was a consensus from the founding to 1940 that the United States should avoid what would be construed as military and political entanglements in the so-called old world centered in Europe and including Asia or most of Asia. I just think it's important not to misidentify that with isolationism, which is a term nobody really thought to use until the 1930s and 40s, and then for quite polemical purposes.
Mm-hmm. Of course, I'm going to have no choice but to bring another book because it was titled Isolationism, and we had an event very recently, Charles Kupchan from Georgetown University. In that book, the framework is such that he explains what you explained and sees isolationist kind of ideas, starting with George Washington, actually, as his, famous lines about entanglements in European power politics. He sees it as a strong impulse, almost like a default position for the US up until the Cold War, which he sees it as kind of a aberration or exception. And then even today, that impulse being strong. I know you don't agree with the term isolationism being used prior to 1940, but that kind of sense that we should stay, protected within the continent and, protected by two seas and not deal with European politics, European matters of war and peace, seems to be a strong American impulse, and ongoing one. And he says, like, we need to pay attention to it. And then looking forward, we need to, understand this impulse very well. So what is your take on, I know you don't agree with the labeling, but pre-1940, because America did expand. It was an expansionist power, right? It overtook territory in the Americas. And it toyed with some of the, Philippines and having that kind of interventions around, limited intervention prior to 1940. I don't want to talk too much, but what's your take on that?
Yes. So, I think if you redefine some of our terms, there's a lot of similarity between the story that Charlie Kupchan tells and the one that I tell. The periodization is somewhat similar. And I think where we agree, and this is important, is that, yes, for most of American history, there was a strong consensus around avoiding entanglements, military entanglements, major commitments in Europe and most of Asia. That was a extremely durable and wide consensus in American foreign policy, perhaps we're seeing some aspects of that consensus return in our own time. That's debatable. But I think the point is incredibly valuable. But I think we dismiss it a little bit too much, or it's very hard to. I respect the way that Charlie, tries to give a definition of isolationism, but I think we have to kind of understand how that term emerged in actual usage, because the term it's just clearly quite pejorative. And so once you start saying, well, this person's an isolationist, but maybe there's something to learn here, it's hard to compute. And the very term came into existence, as my book documents, because really I'm a conceptual historian, if anything, that's at least part of my methodological toolkit. So I'm very interested in the way terms actually develop in history and are used in history. So this term was developed in order to obfuscate, in order to say, okay, there are people who oppose the use of force beyond the hemisphere. They also, therefore, must oppose any kind of US engagement with the outside world. So because they oppose military intervention or military commitments, they oppose all forms of interaction. And I don't think actually that as scholars or public intellectuals, it's enough to just kind of redefine the term and then say, okay, here, I'm going to use the term. There's just an inescapable, deeply embedded 90-year web of meaning that has attached itself. Yeah. So I actually think the term's important, and what's important about it is precisely its usage to turn internationalism, previously about transcending power politics, into something that entailed US armed dominance. Because from the traditional perspective of American internationalism, armed dominance looked unnecessary at best and imperialistic at worst.
Yeah, that shift happens in 1940 and 41. You identify not Pearl Harbor, but the fall of France as the turning point for that consensus to be broken almost, and then U.S. coming up with a new conception. Talk to us about that turning point.
Yeah, so this turning point is triggered by a specific event, which is the shocking conquest of France by Nazi Germany within just 6 weeks in May and June 1940. And that conquest created, for the first time, the plausible, indeed for a while, likely specter that totalitarian powers would become the dominant powers in Europe and Asia. For several months, people assumed that Nazi Germany had solved the riddle of offensive warfare so elusive in World War I and the stalemated conditions of World War I. It might well go on to, well, surely it would go on to rule Europe for the foreseeable future. Then it formed the Tripartite Pact. It might well defeat Britain, take the British Isles, with it the British fleet and the British Empire. And so for the first time, Americans had to decide, what did that mean for the United States? What would it mean for the United States to live in a world where Europe and Asia was dominated by totalitarian powers? And the United States, yes, it could very well, it seemed to most, defend the Western Hemisphere. But it wouldn't necessarily be able to trade on liberal American style terms or do much else in the rest of the world. And a real difference of view, a stark turning point, was exposed. On the one hand, some people with a strong claim to acting in American tradition took the view that the United States was secure in the Western Hemisphere as long as it could defend the entire hemisphere by force to keep any outside invader from gaining a territorial foothold from which they could plausibly invade North America. That was the view of the America First Committee, a very wide-ranging set of Americans. And they had a plausible claim to be internationalists as well as nationalists, that, it was in America's internationalist tradition not to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy and make entangling military commitments in Europe and Asia and get involved in this system of power politics and try to dominate. But on the other hand, most US foreign policy makers, including those in the Roosevelt administration and in semi-official spaces, which were quite important at the time because the US state was still quite small, especially when it came to foreign policy, they were coming to a different conclusion. They were coming to the conclusion that it would maybe be sufficient for American security and prosperity, but it was certainly not ideal for the United States to live in the long term within a hemispheric security perimeter and order. Mm-hmm. And so by the fall of 1940, as Britain proved that it was hanging on, actually, against the Nazi onslaught, they started to think that in order for the United States to maintain other aspirations that it had in the name of American nationalism and internationalism, a desire for universal intercourse, mm-hmm. a desire for a decent American-style world order, a view which we associate today with the term American exceptionalism, that the United States should be the engine of world history. That required much more than a hemispheric conception, but indeed required the United States to hold maximum power in the world, as some of the post-war planners in the Council on Foreign Relations put it in October of 1940. And so it was precisely because, in their view, that traditional internationalism had failed. Yeah. It was naive to think that power politics could ever be transcended, that they thought the United States should then take the lead as the dominant military power and enforce the terms of world order.
Thank you for that. You talk about the critical role played by civilian analysts and experts. You spend a lot of time on CFR, people around CFR, and there's, I guess, a little bit of revolving door as well. Some of them start being employed by the government, and then they define and shape policy at that time. But what I was I wanted to ask you, FDR's role. He seems very receptive, right? He champions this new role for the U.S. And of course, you would remember, like, there was a lot of military buildup prior to it. So how cynical are you about FDR's intentions? Him being readily convinced, almost, of course, not readily. We know that Churchill spent a lot of time, the British spent a lot of time trying to get American support, get involved. But can you talk more about FDR's role? For those who are curious about CFR portion, you can refer to the book for sure. But I was curious more about that, actually.
I think, and this is why I wrote the book the way that I did, that historians have kind of made too much of FDR in a way. I mean, it sounds strange. Such an important president, obviously. Yeah. But, he's pretty much in line with the thinking of a good portion of American foreign policy elites. And if we really want to understand their ideas, FDR is not the person to go to. Reading his tea leaves, very difficult. He's a savvy politician for sure, every right to be one. So, I actually don't, share the kind of theories that FDR was like trying to get the United States into war, or he knew about Pearl Harbor. And I'm critical in the book of some of the non-interventionists who could kind of never get over that and tried to, find scapegoats for what I think was their own defeat in American politics. There was a robust argument. They lost that argument. Of course, power always comes into the equation when we're talking about politics. But it wasn't, I think, fundamentally because, as some of them claim, that, you know, the British were trying to influence U.S. opinion, or you know, FDR was trying to steer the country in one direction or the other. I mean, I think it's actually pretty clear if you look at even public discourse as of the turn of 1940-41, that you know, people like Walter Lippmann, not a obscure figure, were saying the United States is in the war in all but name. We've clearly made a decision that it's more important to support the Allies to make sure that the Axis powers don't win than it is to keep out of war. And the American public from September of 1940 was firmly in support of that position, even if few people, in my view, including FDR, you know, thought it made sense for the United States at that point to formally enter the war as a belligerent. So I have this view of basically de-exceptionalizing FDR. I think he's quite in line with a lot of the thinking that I point out, but particularly when it comes to not the question of, you know, getting the United States into war, but the longer range question of post-war thinking of, you know, what's the nature of international society and the place of America in the world to come. He just doesn't have the, you know, time and space to devote a whole lot of attention to that. And he's quite in line with the thinking of planners who are indeed directly influencing him, including on the question of whether the United Nations should be created, which at first FDR is skeptical about, and then he comes around to based on what he hears from his post-war planners in the State Department.
Yeah, I was struck by how quickly that happened and became adopted as a grand strategy. So that's why I was probing FDR's role, because it's one thing, all these plans being made, but then another thing for it to be adopted, despite actually there's one question here, uh, um, comment actually from Mark Perry. He says, you know, the draft vote actually passed only by a single vote. So in the middle of, it's not like a, yes, you outlined very well how it was sold to the American public, and you know it was a robust discussion, and at the end, non-interventionists, uh, I guess, lost that debate, like you said. But it was a close call. It wasn't like, you know, overwhelming victory for the supporters of that kind of role for the U.S. And he also comments, Mark, that, you know, in the World War II, people like Lindbergh were stigmatized as not only isolationism, but also it was seen as appeasement. Um, so that FDR's role was interesting for me. But then I want to move to my next question about that leadership. There is a debate whether being part of an Anglo world, right, led by the British still, or co-led. But then that debate ends up being about American leadership. Also, I was very curious. You don't talk a lot about economic incentives, but isn't this a story of, at the end of the day, sort of capitalism searching for new markets, and it just can't?
Mm.
Is that, would you consider that kind of drive underneath that enabled expansion in the pre, you know, 1940 period, uh, and in this period, they look at the world. Hey, you know, if all these markets are close to us, what are we going to do?
Well, the United States had the world's largest economy of any country by 1870.
Mm-hmm.
The United States overtook the scale of the combined British Empire, according to Adam Tooze, in the middle of World War I. For all these decades, American foreign policy elites did not think that America's economic supremacy required military supremacy. Mm-hmm. And when I look at the calculations, the specific calculations made in 1940 and 41, economic calculations play a role, but they're not derived from, the baseline of what does the American economy require for its prosperity. But rather, the questions that some of the planners, the Council on Foreign Relations, asked was, how do we create a world order, a sphere that will have more bargaining power than a projected Nazi-dominated Europe, and will make as little compromise with liberal capitalism as possible. So instead of the government regimenting trade in order to strengthening, to be more competitive in a potential geoeconomic competition with an Axis order, the solution to creating more bargaining power was to expand the sphere until essentially it became the entirety of the non-German world. And then once planners began to imagine that Germany could be completely defeated within Europe, the entire world. So this is why it's difficult, I think, to give an obvious, narrowly economistic reading of this decision. Mm-hmm. And I don't intend my book to be anything like the last word. The sources here, the debates are incredibly rich in this period. Mm-hmm. And what I've written is actually a fairly short book. Mm-hmm. But this is why I think, if you push me, there's, I think, a really coherent geopolitical and geoeconomic explanation one can give. And it maps on with a kind of ideological explanation as well. Mm-hmm. About America's place in the world and this aspiration for a basically liberal kind of world order. And those are the explanations that I think were most powerful in that moment.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I want to refer to one more chapter of your book, what you call instrumental internationalism. So we've heard complaints since forever about international organizations being sort of promising to establish peace and order around the world, but then being kind of sacrificed to the great power politics among the big players. And you look at the time period where it was conceptualized, and then to almost like a PR thing for the domestic consumption. It's very counterintuitive in many ways, right? You enter into an international coalition to be able to sell it to your domestic public. Can you explain some of the dynamics of that, how the UN came to be created?
Right. So after I found this decision for dominance, rooted in 1940 and 41, I found another decision that I was not quite expecting to find in the archives, which was a decision to take the State Department planners early in 1942 that the United States should spearhead the creation of a new international organization with universal membership. This was not an obvious choice, given that these same planners had just decided that after the war, the United States should abandon its historic aversion to extra hemispheric entanglement and take up military leadership, precisely because they thought that instruments like the League of Nations were hapless. They had clearly failed to prevent aggression and revisionism in the 1930s and then World War II. They were no solution to the problem of world order. And yet, so why then create a universal organization, which initially FDR was not interested in? It was proposed actually by Winston Churchill in the Atlantic Charter, jointly issued by Churchill and Roosevelt in August of 1941. And at that time, FDR said no. Only America and Britain could keep the peace in the post-war world. That was his view. So there's a shift. And interestingly, the reason that there's a shift, most of all, seems to be about concerns about the American public. Would the American public revert to so-called isolationism, which you might say was actually a way of putting its traditional internationalism after the war, and refuse to be the preeminent power and project military power into Europe across the globe? And they thought that it was imperative for this purpose for the United States to create a new world organization, which becomes the United Nations, with universal membership, to show that the United States was not just another empire, but was leading this sort of rule-based, cooperative, consensual order. And that, is the first and I think most powerful reason given by American post-war planners for why the United Nations should exist. And indeed, as I show in the last parts of the book, in the period of US belligerency in the war from 1942 to 1945, there's a kind of massive effort to have a debate without really another side of that debate amongst the public to win ratification of the UN Charter. But the UN Charter was really not a controversial proposition. And indeed, it sailed through the Senate with just 2 votes in opposition. And so for Americans at the time, what the UN Charter represented was this commitment that the United States was in the world to stay as the preeminent power, and was casting off what was now being roundly called this tradition of isolationism, as if internationalism had always meant that the United States would project power in military terms throughout the world and just had to defeat isolationism in order to be enthroned. And so I think that's a surprising finding, because in our own time, and indeed quickly, as the Cold War progressed, there have been nationalist attacks on U.S. activities through international organizations such as the UN. And so we're used to, the nationalist U.S. view or the pro-power projection view being critical of the UN. But I think it might be worth thinking about the history through the perspective of those who thought it was worthwhile for the United States to create the UN, precisely because it could provide crucial legitimacy for U.S. global leadership. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And indeed, the United States Congress has not bothered to declare war since 1942. And this is something that FDR explicitly said in 1944, that, the UN would be an instrument through which, a rapid use of military force as a policing operation would take place without having to wait for the U.S. Congress to authorize it.
Yeah. Well, several wars, I believe, if I'm not wrong, are being conducted right now, prosecuted on the AUMF, if I'm not wrong, from early 2000s. So you do imagine, there's a very difficult, broad question. Maybe I'll pose that to you, but that is in line with me wanting to bring the discussion to our day. So the question is again from Mark. It's an interesting, even fascinating history, and yet here we are. Is it possible for the U.S. to now, after 80 years since the beginning of World War II, to turn back the clock? How do we reclaim our original conception of a nation that leads by example instead of by force? It's a large
Well,
question, but
that's a doozy.
yes.
I, you know,
This let me put it in my words then,
sure.
because one of my questions is about that. Okay, what is wrong with this, right? Let me be the devil's advocate. US established a liberal capitalist world order. It has worked. Uh, Democracies didn't fight each other. Liberal capitalism is a good thing. Freedom is a good thing. Total. If we left it to the Chinese and the Russians and the others, the world would be a darker place. Goes on and on. So that argument, right? What is wrong with that liberal world order?
Mm-hmm. I
That
have a lot of sympathy
yeah.
for the architects of American primacy,
Mm-hmm.
and I hope it comes through in the book. I think that the circumstances that they faced were terrible, and frankly, I decided to spend all these years, dusting through archives and writing the book because I think it was a very difficult situation. I think that American primacy initially did not respond to a straightforward threat that the United States faced. And yet, in a world stalked by Axis powers and then Soviet-backed communism, there was great force to the idea that, better our power than their power. So I don't dismiss that at all. I think, though, that after the collapse of the Soviet Union,
Mm-hmm.
that even the people who had planned American global dominance, if they had been around, they would have, some of them at least, would have said, wait a minute, the premise of US military dominance was the need for it arose from the existence of an actual totalitarian threat of conquest on a vast scale. And that is not in the cards today. And what better circumstances could there be, talking about the 1990s, for the United States to practice retrenchment and define its interests, its vital interests, the interests over which it would go to war and make security commitments more narrowly. Obviously, that road was not taken, and it was not taken in part because of the legacy of US global leadership and the successes, perceived and real successes of that very task, which of course then built up, the military industrial complex and so forth. But, even if there had not been a military industrial complex, given the accumulated experience and the perceptions of that experience, I'm not, sure how the debate would have gone.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in our own time, then, this history helps us understand, in my view, that US armed primacy has become something like an end unto itself.
Okay.
All right. So that's for the last 3 decades, but you still have the very fair question. Well, what should we do now? I mean, now there's increasing authoritarianism in the world, including among US allies. There's a assertion by, competitors of some size, Russia, China in particular. I'm not for willy-nilly, withdrawals militarily from the world. But I think the United States ought to be a lot more discriminating. And we shouldn't just assume that if the United States pulls back, the absolute worst will happen. I mean, I'm also concerned that if the United States continues to pursue dominance in every region, the worst can happen, meaning a great power war.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a very difficult question. And I still think, I mean, it would have been better for the United States to embark on a less dominant military role in the 1990s. That was the golden opportunity that I think unfortunately was missed. But frankly, today, I think the costs of continuing in this kind of role may be mounting in a world of increasing multipolarity. The dangers of serious costs for the United States above all,
Mm-hmm.
others as well, are going to increase over time.
Yeah, I'll let me continue to be the devil's advocate on one more thing. So when you look at the endless war in Iraq, right, it fits that category. It actually, for many would argue that it started as a good war, right? In the first Gulf War was a good American intervention. It was well designed, allies, and then it pulled out. It exercised restraint, but then second story again, another rupture, perhaps 9/11 and what happened afterwards. But so in that liberal world order, there could be good wars, like good application of American military
Yes,
supremacy. Would you subscribe to that?
absolutely. I mean, look,
Mhm.
when you're the number one power, it makes a big difference if you're judicious and humane in your decisions or not.
Mhm.
And that matters immensely. It matters immensely to me. And you've given a good example, the Persian Gulf War, I think was fought for very strong reasons. I do think, though, that the United States began to station tens of thousands of troops in the Middle East for the first time in the wake of that war. And that is part of the trajectory that has produced endless war for the United States in the region. And of course, the second Iraq War, I think we probably agree on. But what I would, disagree with is the notion that there's some kind of world order, liberal world order, etc., that exists in our 3-decade plus era that is in fact underpinned by U.S. security commitments and dominance in military terms.
Mm-hmm.
There was an argument for that that was quite coherent in the middle of the 20th century. I don't, in fact, think that's the true choice today. And I think we have to rank, not just, reckless use of force by a whole range of actors, but also the United States as obstructions to what I would identify as rules and liberal order. So that calculus needs to include everybody. We have to look at sanctions policies as well as obstructions.
Yeah. I want to take one more question. This is from Robert Friedman. Would you not have used military power to stop the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and the attacks on Kosovo Muslims?
Right. Well, I think for the United States, again, it would be better, and frankly, I think this is true of the international community, for the United States, in structural terms, to step back and not always be in the position of having to face difficult questions like this. Is it the United States that is called upon to take the lead to undertake humanitarian interventions, for example? I'm quite sympathetic to the intervention on behalf of Bosnia, which was an internationally recognized state, which is often not the case in questions of humanitarian intervention. When you're taking actions in that vein, there is at least a kind of plausible post-war outcome that one can get to. Kosovo, I think, a much more difficult case where there were significant costs in structural terms, doing an end run around the Security Council. I mean, that was an illegal war, as some admitted at the time. The humanitarian consequences in the short run may have been positive, although then again, when Milosevic capitulated, it was something of a surprise to American policymakers who were already starting to think about sending in 175,000 NATO forces in a ground invasion. So what I think is most important there is just that, those interventions, we shouldn't overread the lessons, I think, from those interventions. Even if you support them, those were, rare cases where humanitarian intervention look a bit better. These are kind of the shining cases than in other cases. And I would say that, we should be more concerned with sins of commission in the use of force by the United States and any other state, and a little bit less concerned about alleged sins of omission than we've been for the last several decades.
Yeah. So when you look at a trend that started with perhaps Obama after the Iraq War and continued under Trump, do you see sort of the U.S. foreign policy moving away from global supremacy to some extent, at least? Every president now promises to pull out of these wars, and they tend to reduce the footprint overall. They can't fully pull out, but that's another story. Do you see a movement in the right direction in that sense? And how do you see, Trump-Biden dichotomy? Is it a dichotomy in this sense?
Yeah, there is. I tend to think of history in dialectical terms. Mm-hmm. So I think on the one hand, I think we all kind of recognize, we folks in the town behind me and you, that, there's no going back to the unipolar moment of the 1990s for the United States or anybody else. And there was a lot of hubris involved. I think on the one hand, there is a movement to change course by adopting the framework of great power competition, as the Trump administration's Pentagon has put it, and try to refocus U.S. efforts away from, say, the Middle East, possibly away from Europe, and toward the rise of China in particular. And that is to a degree rational. But on the other hand, it could result in the United States applying some of the same indiscipline in its foreign policy to relations of graver consequence. Mm-hmm. Nor do I personally see China as, committed to the kind of conquest or domination that would slot it into the ranks of the Axis powers or Soviet-backed communism. It could happen, but I do not see the capability or the behavior as of now. Mm-hmm. So I'm concerned about.
Yeah, many would argue that it will get there, right? Their recent military moves in the South China Sea, and there's also domestic politics here. The shipping of all those jobs. There's a economic side to this. Are we at another moment of saying, look, we have to respond, right? Like maybe 1940, we have no choice but to respond for geopolitical, economic, and ideological reasons.
There's clearly a powerful tendency to say that, and with a lot of evidence of, aggressive Chinese and objectionable Chinese actions to back it up. But, on the other hand, China is not about to invade, or think anybody believes it's about to invade, U.S. allies like Japan or South Korea, Philippines, etc. The United States could use the period of time that it has now to pull back, encourage, incentivize its allies and partners to step up. They are more threatened by potential Chinese aggression than the United States is from across the Pacific Ocean. So it depends, how much the United States wants to put itself on the front lines of a potential future conflict. But the other, trend that I think you're pointing to, starting from maybe 15 years ago, as the Iraq War went clearly south, and we saw Barack Obama, I think, become the Democratic nominee in 2008 because of his opposition to the Iraq War, and so on. The other trend is a trend that really questions what is the United States doing in the world? Why is it defining its vital interests and thus its threats so expansively? And obviously, I'm part of an effort to really press on that question and make the United States much more discriminating in the way it makes security commitments and so forth. But I think it's not and clearly there are powerful structural trends domestically and internationally pointing in this direction. So I do expect, we see some lines of continuity from Obama to Trump to, I expect, a Biden administration that will point in the direction of retrenchment, or at the very least, not, continuing a trend toward overextension. Yeah. So I think, that will continue. What I worry about is that if the United States can't find a way at some point to say, yes, we can make prudent retrenchments in a responsible way, that it will be so overcommitted at a certain point that really difficult circumstances will arise. Essentially, our bluff will be called in several different places at once. And that would have extremely negative consequences, both for the United States and for the allies in question.
Stephen, just as you were talking in the last minute, 3 questions popped up. So I want to answer them all, but we only have, 3-5 minutes. 2 of them are on China, so I'll combine them. One asks, Michael Kurzik asks, what about Taiwan? There's a real danger of Chinese aggression, ? And then the other one is, do you believe that the US, from Steve Desina, do you believe that the US needs to respond to China's Belt and Road economically as they did militarily to the Axis and the Soviets? And can you equate Belt and Road economic conquest to Axis and Soviet ambitions for military conquest?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. I don't equate Chinese actions through the Belt and Road with military conquest. And I think it's actually quite important to separate the economic challenges as well as the technological challenges, environmental challenges that China poses, which are profound, from military challenges. And they're all getting kind of lumped together, I fear, in U.S. thinking, especially over the past 4 years, over the course of the Trump administration. And so I think, and if you're, really concerned, for example, about being competitive with China economically, seems to me that, spending half of the U.S. federal discretionary budget year after year on the Pentagon is not an asset, that more domestic investments should be made. And we can come up with better deals for states that seek development assistance and other forms of aid, if that's what we think is so significant. So we've got to, I think, disaggregate some of these challenges from China, because again, its record of military external military aggression has not been, it's not that I'm sanguine, but it has not been anything like, what we saw from the Axis powers or the Soviet Union as well. Now, Taiwan is different, of course, and that is a very difficult challenge.
Yeah.
There's some discussion now about whether the United States should abandon its historic policy of strategic ambiguity and make an explicit commitment to defend Taiwan. I fear that would be destabilizing. I think the United States ought to. I mean, do not want to see China invade Taiwan. And I would like Taiwan, ideally, I think we probably all like Taiwan, to be able to defend itself. And the United States, I think, should, if necessary, give Taiwan weapons that can turn it into a porcupine and enable it to practice mutual denial with China that could result in a more stable situation. But it's a quite concerning situation right now. What I fear, though, is that the United States may put itself on the front lines of a potential conflict. And that is a situation at the very least the United States should be working to avoid, not actively trying to seek.
Last question. We are over our time, but I want to get to it. Well, Michael Oppenheimer is asking, was the decision not to retrench post-Cold War a reflection of the view that the end of history was a transitory moment and that allowing the institutions of primacy to atrophy would find us again at a 1940 moment?
That's a very interesting question because it's contrary to conventional wisdom. One of the books I might have in me would be a book on precisely the 1990s and the thinking about the future there. So maybe that's to be determined and investigated by me in the future. I mean, the conventional view is the opposite, that primacy was instituted out of confidence that the end of history moment would endure. And, to take, for example, the defense planning guidance issued toward the end of the George H.W. Bush administration, the view was that the United States was so powerful and could maintain such dominance in every region that it would dissuade both potential U.S. adversaries and U.S. allies from building up strength of their own. But a very provocative question.
Yeah. Stephen, I want to thank you and all the participants very much. I still had questions, so because it's such an interesting discussion. Do buy it, read it. It's a great book. Thank you, Stephen, for joining this discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for all.